Welcome. My name's Sandy McLean. There's lots of familiar faces here. Which one do you need? Both of these. Okay. Sounds like we need more handouts. That one?
Thank you.
And
just the other side. Thank you.
okay.
You have an extra one?
Yes. Here we go. Wellness wheel. So are we going to stick to the same end, the appropriate end time to keep on schedule?
Try.
Okay. Great. Which is good for me to know. And there's one more that I think he has that you can get later. Use the mic? Do I need the mic? Can everyone hear me? Okay, super. I'll project. If there's anybody who can't hear me, please just make us some kind of ear signal and I'll either shout louder or I've never been accused of being quiet. So my name's Sandy McLean. I'm currently working in private practice as a counselor in Nelson. I've worked in the field for 15 years. Most of my career was at adult mental health in various roles, mostly counseling with addictions and trauma and all range of things that we support people with at adult mental health. And I have, since the very beginning of my training, had a kind of passion about trauma that I was infected with when I was at UVic in a time when half of the instructors in our program were really immersed in what was then really new ways of thinking about trauma recovery, like basically working from the body up, not just from the thoughts down, but from the nervous system up. So now this field that more people know about now is sort of somatic kind of approaches to working with trauma. We'll get into that a little bit. So I did a 3 or 4 year training in somatic psychotherapy modalities, and I felt so grateful as soon as I started working that how much I needed that work, because what I realized was the gift of that training was partially for my clients, but mostly it was for me. It was that I found myself using those tools nonstop to work with my own nervous system and stay really alive in this work. So then since doing, so trauma's always been a passion for me, but specifically the idea of how to use knowledge that's out there about trauma recovery to support clinicians and people working in the field, helping in any way to be more resilient in our work in the long term. And I probably needed that most as a mom. And so I say helping in the broadest sense of the word. We all have different roles of helping. So these are the little crimpled up sticky notes of self-care. Don't remember, just slow down, keep calm, be positive, take it easy. And I love that there's sort of these crimpled up sticky notes, because that kind of feels like the way my life runs sometimes. Oh wait, don't forget to pull that one out of the garbage and stick it back on the wall. So I'm curious here, just as a quick, how many people here are in sort of a job where they're taking care of individuals in some way? Okay. And people who haven't raised up their hand, so how many people here are sort of family members or community members in general, just interested in the subject that's happening in this conference? Great. And then any other people that aren't yet captured in either of those descriptions?
We're students.
Students, wonderful. And first responders, any folks here, first responders? Okay, super. I just wanted to get a feel for who's here. We can't really talk, none of us are separate from trauma, not just because of the work we do, but also because we had childhoods, we had imperfect lives, we've been abused, we've been assaulted. We are all human, and trauma is part of a very common human experience. So whenever we talk about trauma in general, it can be triggering. So for me, I never talk about the subject of trauma without just naming that that's common and normal, and I want you to just track yourself and take care of yourself, because at very least, if you're going to go to a workshop like this, then you want to be able to have permission to walk out of the room and go take a little glass of water if you need it, and do whatever you need. So I'd be happy for you to miss a little bit or a lot of this presentation for that benefit, because that would probably be that's the practice we're kind of aiming at anyway. So do it right now, and take care of yourself. And on that note, because we don't have a lot of time to take care of ourselves in this 1 hour talk, if we get into discussions and we're sharing stories, I'm just going to ask that we share stories not with a lot of like visual detail, you know? It can happen because we have trauma kind of stored in our memories that I can say, oh, that reminds me of this, this, and this, and suddenly I'm in a group like this sort of sharing part of those trauma imagery, and we don't need to go home today with new trauma imagery from each other, specifically because we don't really have time to process it in any helpful way. So just if you're just hard event, an assault, like kind of just not the details, you know, that kind of thing, if you would. So we're going to cover these different pieces. The slides, I always have more slides than we're going to get into, but it'll give you, you know, just a range. I like to stop and have lots of conversation if it comes up. So these are the general topics. Is there anyone who can't read who really wants to make sure, who can't read from the distance they're sitting? Okay. Wonderful. So I want to take a little pause right now and just to resource all of us before this talk. I want you to, with your eyes open or closed, whichever is comfortable for you, I want you to kind of drop into your own memories of maybe the last week, the last little while in your life, wherever you need to drop into to find just a moment that stands out of some kind of positive quality of joy. Could be any simple thing, doesn't have to be fancy. It could be the way you like your coffee. It could be any little moment. Just kind of let your mind kind of filter through some of the last few days until you land on one or two that you want to use right now. And I just want you to picture some of those details for a minute. Picture if there's people involved in your memory, picture their faces. Feel your own imagined face of how you experienced that experience. See some of the colors. If you can remember where you were, what the atmosphere was like. But just let those play like a little mini movie in your imagination or in your thoughts. And once you've got it, just kind of notice what your body feels like. If there's any shift in your body or not, just kind of notice if there's any place in your body below the neck where it kind of registers some emotion or some physical feeling that go with that memory for you. And then when you're ready, if you've had your eyes closed, just open them back up and take a little second to do that. Kind of looking around the room, not necessarily at the people, but just orienting to the space first. So just kind of taking a quick look around where you are, feel yourself sitting in the chair. And I don't know what images you're using. Some of them might be too personal to share. So if that was true for you, then really quickly you can think of a different one that you might have chosen. But I'd love, for whoever's comfortable, for you to just, for 1 or 2 moments at your tables, just share really briefly what some of the joyful things that came to your mind that you're comfortable sharing. So have a little discussion at your table for a second.
My dog. I have my dog. Lab grass.
I sold my really nice bed frame. I sold her bed frame.
shift on Thursday morning. Yeah. Thank
Mine was heard from the designer, like this actually 5 years before the conference.
Okay, if anyone who wants to share hasn't yet, just kind of wrap it up. Give it a word or two if you want. I've been doing taxes all week and then took some time to prepare for this, so I haven't had a lot, but what came to my mind was my little floppy-eared puppy, who's just, it's really amazing. I've heard for 12, 15 years as a trauma therapist, most people's easiest go-to is their animal, and I've had cats in my life, but it's my first dog, and gosh, I really get it. I really get it. I really get it now. I didn't get it before totally, but anyhow. This exercise is about two things. It's about the fact that we have this amazing map. Even people with unbelievably hard lives have little moments of okayness, little moments of a break or something that they, even a preference. Just why that preference? Why do you prefer that kind of a weather day or those kind of slippers? They're there as little files that we can tap into, and it changes our physiology to do that. And then to share about that is a whole nother thing, which is that we, build relationships around, when we work in supporting people who've had hard lives, we often share a lot about our distress and our hard things or other people's hard things. But the simple practice of just like waking up the files that contain joy or peace or loveliness, and then having practices, habits in our teams, in our worlds, in our families, where we actually take time to talk about that. It changes our face, it changes our body. We're a networked system, and we have these files that we can look for. And for people who have a hard time finding those files, then they can have the experiment of going through life and just kind of noticing even preferences, and then trying to collect more of those kind of conscious pieces. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of vocabulary. And there's a lot of interchangeable words that go with the way hard stories and things that we encounter in our work might affect us. They're pretty interchangeable. I'm not too fussy about the academics of it. But I like some of the preparing I was doing for this. I came across this whole other category of compassion satisfaction, which we don't often talk about when we're thinking of burnout and work-related traumatic stress. And compassion satisfaction is positive aspects of working as a helper, the pleasure you derive from being able to do your work well. And if you go into it a little more, there's one of the handouts that has a bit of a paragraph on that. Just the meaning, what it means to you in the bigger picture of the world, things it might mean to you spiritually. There's a whole world for many, many people in this field of that. And it's an aspect of what we pay attention to when we're talking about negative impacts of our work, but it's also a buffer. We can endure some very hard things, and it's partly because people who work in this field and live as someone who likes to help other people tend to be people who get some of this compassion satisfaction. Compassion, fatigue, burnout, and then work-related traumatic stress. They're all words that relate to how this kind of work can wear on us in ways. And like I said, the more I looked into it, the more I saw that different people in different literature seem to use these words in different ways. So I'm not that fussy about that, but there's a continuum, and people use the language that makes sense for them. I was recently training with in a 2-day workshop on building capacity as a therapist to work with first responders, and he sort of he explained that even the idea of having a disorder doesn't really work for certain, for say his firefighter comrades. So he was saying that for them, like just the idea of it being like a stress injury was way more palatable. And I'm all for people owning whatever language they like, whatever works for them. But certainly burnout as a general term could be used across a wide range of fields, whereas compassion fatigue, work-related traumatic stress, tends to be more for people who are in fields where they are helping and they start off with all the best intentions, having a lot of empathy for the people they're helping and working with, and then it builds. So burnout's, I think, the term that's maybe more generic and doesn't necessarily relate only to people in kind of a helping role. So the gist of this is that the very qualities that make us effective in a helping capacity also make us vulnerable to injury from overexposure, to stressful stories, hardship, death, loss. Because we are better maybe than average of being able to feel with people and put ourselves in people's shoes, but our brainstem doesn't always understand that that's not happening to this body. You know, so a lot of the skills we're going to get to a little bit later are all about these really simple practices that help to allow you to stay present, show up with people, but also keep your brainstem very much knowing that this isn't my story. And that's important because, you know, if you're like me, there's way more stories that have come through your ears and your eyes and your presence than you would really maybe even be able to survive as a one individual. So it's really important if you're in a work where you're meeting this on a regular basis, directly or indirectly, that you have a lot of ways to help your brainstem understand it's not you. And I'll get into a little bit more what I mean by that.
Sandy,
Yeah,
are we able to get this PowerPoint?
absolutely. I have cards, and even I didn't want to create mountains and mountains of paper that people may or may not want, but please email me. I'll leave my card here so you know how to find it. Email me, and then I'll happily send it out.
I think what we're going to do is get a sign-up sheet here. I'll have to talk to the MC and for all the presentations that people can access.
Super. So secondary traumatic stress used to be more important as a distinction because the DSM, the diagnostic manual for the way they categorize different problems people have with their emotions, used to be that you didn't, you know, you had to either witness an event yourself or you had to, in order to qualify for that diagnosis, you had to witness an event or be the subject of an attack or something violent that happened to you. And now that those lines have blurred, because DSM-5 got more sophisticated and realizing that doesn't make sense. We can be affected by the stories we hear, of course. We can be affected by our family members who have gone through something. So people can have the symptoms that we know associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. But in this era where those people didn't count as having post-traumatic stress disorder, came up with this idea of secondary stress. And I'm going to talk in a moment. This kind of outlines some of the symptoms, but it's the natural consequent behaviors and emotions resulting from knowledge about traumatizing events experienced by significant others. It's a stress resulting from helping or wanting to help traumatized or suffering person. That's one person's definition. And it can come on suddenly and it can come on gradually. And it's on a continuum. Is kind of the gist of it. So what's important is that we recognize it because there's no person who's necessarily immune to this kind of effect on our psyche. And a lot of us in this field, you know, you might have heard someone say, I can't even imagine that you do this work. I couldn't do that work. You know, if you're like me, people might say that to you knowing what you do. And we might actually have an identity based on what it was like to be in this field in our first 5 years that says, you know, I'm good. It worked. I'm okay. I don't find it affects me. But it also, that might change. It can change over time. It can change for reasons that don't really make sense to our mind. So it's important that we learn about it, that we kind of recognize it, and there's no person that has like the qualities of a psyche where this could never happen. You know, and that it's really important about that because yes, there's predisposing factors, there's things, if I had a lot of trauma in my childhood, I might be more vulnerable, but there's plenty of people who've been affected with secondary traumatic stress who don't know why. Who just like, I was listening, there was a firefighter saying, for 30 years I was resilient to this and then had debilitating psychological effects from one call, and I can't, I know they knew that something about that call reminded them of something personal in their life, but it was like a tipping point, and it didn't make sense intellectually why that call, and suddenly they were, throwing up whenever a phone call came in, things like that, really dramatic effects. So we have to be a little humble about our own body and brains, that we don't just get to decide what's going to affect us and what's not. We have to sort of be responsible for paying attention and for being clear, and then having tools, and then maybe going out and getting more tools if our tools are suddenly surpassed. So the general, this is hard, impossible to read, it's more for me. The general DSM-5 diagnosis of PTSD, what's important to understand about the PTSD effect in terms of, is that it relates to being exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, actual or threatened sexual violence. It could be stuff that happens to us, something that happens to our family members, something you witness, or something you hear about. And the various symptoms that are in this world of being affected by hard stories and hard experiences have a really big range. So there's flashbacks. We are all familiar with this idea of flashbacks. A war vet might be having, hear a car backfire and they're having a flashback and they literally hit the deck because they think it's, they're back there. So there's obvious kind of flashbacks where you have flashes of the past coming in when you don't want it. But there's also what I call a body flashback, where you're just having like an emotional kind of feeling and you don't even realize it's actually a flashback, where part of your brain, nervous system, body is actually back in some other moment. So there's intrusion symptoms, which is basically things coming out of nowhere, it feels like, that you didn't ask for and you're not trying to think about. And then the impulse to want to avoid those things. So we start getting into wanting to avoid triggers. So an urge to avoid things that might trigger that. So, and I think we can all relate to that, it's like, oh, I don't like to hear that kind of music because it brings this up, or, we start to limit our world. I get kind of freaked out in crowds, so now I don't really want to go to the grocery store unless it's after 9 o'clock when no one's there. Simple ways that we would naturally want to avoid pain, so we avoid things that might trigger us. And there's this whole group that's basically depression. Feeling sad, having sad thoughts, feeling not that interested in things that should be interesting, having negative talks about ourselves, feeling bad about ourselves. So that's the whole world that we normally think of as depression symptoms, and that's all embedded into post-traumatic stress as one of the group. And then the last one is alterations in arousal and reactivity that are associated with traumatic events. So this is where you're easily jumpy if a buzzer goes off and you kind of like, but also it's being really grouchy. It's being irritable in ways that are maybe different than you normally would be. Anger and recklessness, vigilance. So these awesome firefighters that I spent these recent days with, one of them said, if I was writing a children's story for the families of firefighters, it would be, why Daddy's an asshole. Because he was saying that is such a common thing, and this is this bit about anger. It's like irritability and anger as like an symptom of being overstimulated in your nervous system to this moments of danger can be a symptom.
Is that where you put, remember when you talked about the hypoactive response to trauma?
Yes.
And when they say alterations, so I wonder, would that fall into that one, do you think?
He's talking about another training he did with me on trauma-informed practice. I think that's can be more the depressive side. It depends. And certainly people can be kind of dissociative or numb and then jump into irritability. So I think that's why these symptoms kind of cover both the kind of overactive anxious as well as the flat numb, because that's the way kind of unprocessed trauma affects us. concentration, and sleep. So I'm going to just zoom a little bit ahead. Vicarious trauma has been defined as the transformation that occurs within care providers as a result of empathic engagement with their clients. There is a threat of vicarious trauma is increased for staff with a history of trauma. So there's a lot of factors that go into who, there's been lots of studies to try to say who's more vulnerable to being affected in this way by their work. Naturally, anybody who's had more of those ACEs that Zach was talking about, the early incidents of hardship, things that you've gone through in your life, the more loaded your prehistory of trauma, you might be more vulnerable, as well as having other things going on in your life. Suddenly that can be the tipping point where now your work is affecting you a lot more because you're going through something really hard in your personal life or something hard in your family is happening. So there can be factors that go into who might be more vulnerable, and there's been some research on that. So on the one hand, so professional quality of life, you have the stapled package. This is a survey that I'm just giving you because I think it's very well done. It's an instrument that was developed to try to capture some of these things and help us assess in a kind of standardized way what's happening. And it covers, on one continuum, compassion, satisfaction, where all the good things we might get out of being in this work. And then over on the other continuum is compassion fatigue, and then within that we might have burnout experience or more secondary trauma. The shorthand for the secondary trauma tends to be the burnout is a little bit more about tiredness and lack of engagement, whereas the secondary trauma tends to have a little bit more of that kind of afraid, fear, anxiety charge going on. But again, we're fancy, like the brain is a complex being. These are just boxes and what's I think more important is to sort of pay attention to yourself and sort of say, okay, maybe there's some changes that have happened and what's happening, how do I find I'm able to connect with clients the way I used to? Do I find I'm this sort of more irritable? Do I find I'm more disinterested in my job? There's these different markers, but they're going to be stronger for one person than the other in various categories. So the most important thing is to kind of pay attention to changes, I think, for all of us. So here they're talking about burnout being more like work-related hopelessness and feelings of inefficacy. And then secondary traumatic stress, STS, is work-related exposure to extremely traumatic or stressful events, and both share the negative emotions. This is a little map that just talks about all the different factors kind of and how it interplays. So work environment, client environment, what's happening in your client's life, and then your own personal environment. So all of these factors, and work environment isn't just the work you do, but also the kind of culture of the work, the current climate of the management relationship with their staff, like all of those factors can play in, and they all relate to compassion satisfaction as well as compassion fatigue. And then it kind of on a continuum goes towards exhaustion, frustration, and anger, being depressed by the work environment, burnout, and then down into being actually traumatized. So the real difference, the same, like the reason it's good to just think broadly is that it's a continuum. So I might not relate to the idea that I'm traumatized, but I actually might have a bunch of the symptoms that are going in that direction. So all that means is I meet a slightly different category that isn't quite there, but that it's all still relevant. So yeah, in terms of this that you have in your handout, there's one set of questions that are about this compassion satisfaction, and then another set of questions that are about the burnout. So it basically, the package you have, one's double-sided, allows you to score yourself and then actually like do the ratings and then score yourself. And they have very specifically, you'll see in the burnout, when you're actually trying to score yourself on the burnout scale, that you have to do a funny math little trick there because they asked in a very specific way after the research.